Hey,
Hello, hello.
how are you?
I am good. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Trying to prepare
Recording stuff. Well, just
the
wanted to
show.
log in, make sure you had everything. I am available all night.
Okay.
Um, but like you mentioned, you're a pro at this. You
Yeah.
got it covered. So, if anything, let me know. I'm available. Um, Dora, thanks for being on. I also owe you a couple meeting times as well. So I'll be in touch with you tonight as well.
Okay. Thank you, Patrick. Appreciate it. All right. Well, if anyone's with me besides Dora and Patrick, you're able to come off the camera and let's come on camera, should I say, and we'll get started just to be respectful of everyone's time. Hi, Andrea. How are you? Good. Okay. All right. Anybody else we're
I'm
expecting or
good. How are
running
you?
late? I'm good. Thank you. I'm
Sorry,
gonna turn my
I was muted.
Oh, that's okay. I'm glad you're here. I'm gonna turn my volume up so I don't sound muted. Let's see here. So I know a storm is coming. So for those of us that we all have internet, so if you get kicked off or what have you, or you need to check on your fam or your dog, just take yourself off camera, do what you have to do. You don't have to let me know. I know the storm can be very damaging and messes with our virtual world, so I'm very mindful of that. Patrick or Dora, do you know if anyone else is coming? I know we got about
Was
three people.
wondering the same thing. I'm wondering if what is impacting my actual work is impacting the same thing, that being spring break.
Hmm.
I don't know if spring break has been, we're kind of in that like middle ground where somewhere last week, somewhere this week. So
Yeah. Okay.
um, I can send out a note to everyone to see if they were joining, and if not,
Yeah.
seems like it might be the group.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, I'll go ahead and get started. Hello, Kelly. How are you? All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Just wanted to kind of follow with you all from last week. How did your studying go? How was everything? Um, do you feel like you did a great job in between job as far as your studying and understanding the concepts? Just curious to see how things went for you.
For me, I'd say in between.
In between, okay. How are you feeling? Are you feeling more confident about the material, or are you still feeling a little bit lost?
Feeling a little bit more, I'm feeling better about the content. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Is there anything I can do for you regarding this context or content for this week? Any particular thing you want me to spend more time on, or something in your reading that you want me to dive deep into?
Not that I can think of. This material is a little bit more familiar to me, so
Yes. Yeah. Much more easier for a lot of us to
yeah,
understand.
yeah.
All right. Thank you for that, Andrea. How about you? How was your studying, and how are you feeling regarding the content and absorbing it?
Think the content about the HR the structural models were a little bit confusing to me.
Okay.
Like the centralized, functional, all those things, because they have some things in common, and it's kind of hard for me to really see the differences and apply them on the questions that were on the test. I didn't do so well.
Okay, that's okay. That's okay. Yeah, just a little bit probably more practice. And
Mhm.
so eventually just kind of keeping it in front of you will kind of help for you to kind of memorize it or understand the context of it, especially when you're walking through the questions, just understanding the why behind Sherm chose that answer instead of our natural instincts to say this is what we do in our everyday HR career. So just understanding the why behind why they chose that answer would definitely help with that. As far as your reading this week, is there anything regarding today's content want me to kind of dive a little deep into?
Maybe the interventions.
Okay. Okay. There is one slide, and I have that here. There's one slide me and Patrick laughed about that has content missing, but for the most part, I do have most of the intervention slides that did download from what him and I were able to obtain. So, yeah, I can spend a little time talking about that too. Okay, cool. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. So same as usual, I'll just kind of, go through some of the slides. I'll give you some practical, examples that will be helpful for you. As we know, I don't read every slide. I just try to, speak to them and give you examples. If there's something that comes across that you want me to dive deep into, take yourself off mute or what have you, and we'll get through it. But for this week, we're going to be talking about organizational effectiveness and development, which is also one of my favorite topics to kind of cover. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. And so when we kind of look at organizational effectiveness and what that model looks like, the model is consistent of what I call this circle of SHRM, right? It's a whole circle of components that make up the organizational model. So, we know strategy is important. We know structure is important. We know cultural and systems and values and leadership make up this organizational model. And from there, we get the components: government risk, management and compliance, employee engagement and retention, and organizational team. So if I had to sum this up for you, think of an organization as a big component umbrella, but every organization has an organizational model which consists of these components. Every organization has to have a foundation of strategy and execution. They have to have a foundation of structure. They have to have a foundation of their systems that they operate in order to run their organization effectively. They're also going to have a culture on how they work and live and how they manage their human capital. They're going to have values as an organization, and then they're going to have leadership at all different levels. So if you look at the organizational model, every company has one, and they're all going to have these components that make up an organizational model. From there, they have to look at compliance. They have to manage risk. They have to be able to look at employee engagement and retention, as well as the organizational as a whole, the team and the individual performance. Because as I mentioned last week, everyone contributes to the organizational strategy, whether they're from senior leadership all the way down to the janitor. Everyone is contributing something. That janitor is contributing to the overall operation and, looking at the company and making sure it's clean and making sure it's shiny and the windows are done. And then you have the COO that contributes to the operational from a C-suite. Then you have the IT person that contributes from a system standpoint. So everyone within an organization contributes overall to the organizational model. When you kind of look at what do these interventions look like, there's going to be two components when you talk about OED. It's going to be proactive or remedial. Okay, so again, if I was studying with you all, I would have to just think of this as, hey, organizational model, organizational effectiveness is going to have an intervention, and two of those interventions is going to be proactive or remedial. Okay, and these interventions is going to interrupt that status quo to try to examine more closely what changes need to take place to improve outcomes. So when we think of organizational intervention, plainly, clarity, on its face, what it means is what type of interventions does an organization try to step into to try to either mitigate risk or try to improve their organization. That's really what organizational effective is in layman terms. It's much more broader than that, but if you had to kind of say, okay, how do I sum it up? They're trying to look at how do we look at our organization to be proactive, and are we being remedial? Are we in the middle? What does it look like? And how do we intervene to mitigate risk and or to improve the organization's outcomes? Because again, an organization is in business to do one thing, and that's to make money, right? And so some of the characteristics of effective intervention, I'm kind of laughing because here is one slide that just wants to say hi to us in its blankness, but go ahead and make a note of this for you to study on your own, the characteristics of effective intervention. And that way you'll kind of know what the characteristics is. So let's talk about why interventions fail. Okay, we understand the organizational model. Hello, Brent. Thanks for joining. We understand, on its face, what an organization is there to do. We know all the components: leadership, cultural systems, and now we know that it's either going to be proactive or remedial. But we have to really understand when we talk about organizational effectiveness, why do they fail? They fail just like any other type of movement within an organization, any other type of initiative. Either you don't have leadership buy-in or leadership is not involved. And again, if we go back to this whole era, that started years ago with different initiatives within your organizations and organizations that I worked in, a lot of times they fail because the leadership did not get involved. And so OE is no different, okay? Leadership does not get involved, and this is one of the many reasons that it fails. Another reason it fails is because of the wrong strong messengers. I kind of look at this kind of component that you have individuals that it's a lot of chiefs and a lot of Indians, and you're trying to figure out what message, who do I listen to? Well, it came from my manager, but my manager didn't get it from the CEO, but then someone else in a meeting said so-and-so said this about the organization, and you got all these mixed messages, and that too can contribute to the OE falling or failing because of that, because of mixed messaging. And then of course the communication is either too sudden, as I call it, overwhelming. Sometimes it's too late. Sometimes it's not at all. As I mentioned to someone I was talking to last week, with all the layoffs that's taking place in both the public and the private sector and government, how an organization handled their human capital during times of layoff speaks volumes, right? And so although, it's something that has to take place, I understand efficiency, I understand, looking at an organization from a high level, but how you handle your human capital is so important too. Sometimes messages don't come at all. Some people find out right then and there. And that's what we're finding to know about some of these layoffs, is that some people are getting it too late. Some people are not knowing at all that it's coming. They go to work and then they come home fired. You know what I mean? And so OED is no different. It fails because of those messages that are too late or not aligned with organizational realities, or they may be too narrow. So these are some of the things why organizations fail. When you talk about trying to look at redesigning the organization, organizational design is basically optimizing elements to support the organization's function, right? So that's looking at the mission, the vision, and the strategies. It's looking at how decisions are made, when decisions are made, what information to communicate, what information to hold back and wait for, what processes do you use to perform work to the degree in which that work is performed, and then looking at those systems, your infrastructure, to align with your organizational needs. So all of this comes into play when we talk about OED, looking at this organizational effectiveness. What does the design look like? And sometimes an organization has to redesign in terms of how they do business and how they optimize their profit, because that's, again, they're in business to make money. So any organization that takes it really seriously when it comes to OE is really ahead of the curve when it comes to most organizations. When you talk about looking at structural characteristics of an organizational design, it's looking at that work specification, layers of hierarchy, who reports to who, that organizational chart, decision-making authority. What does that look like? Is it functional? Is it matrix? Is it multidimensional? Is it one-dimensional? And then the formalization when you're trying to look at how to design your organization and the characteristics that go into play with that. When you talk about looking at those structures, again, it's going to be 4 levels. And I would encourage you to know a little bit about this slide here. Okay. I think I mentioned to you when I say hint, that is something that you may need to just make sure you understand the difference. So understand the difference between functional, product and customer, geographic, and matrix. And these, again, are different structures when it comes to an organization. Functional, product or customer, geographic, and matrix. So when we talk about looking at OE, organizational effectiveness, and assigning roles when it comes to new structures, we have what we call the RACI matrix. When you talk about OE development, when you talk about OE design, you will find that a lot of the HR professionals or those that specify and operate in this space of OE, they will use the RACI matrix, okay? They'll use the Delphi technique. They'll use quite a bit of different type of project management techniques in order to figure out what is the structure of O&E, how do we design it, what are our elements, and how do we optimize our organization to its highest effectiveness, right? And so they'll use the RACI matrix. And I would encourage you to know what RACI is, okay? So that's looking at who's responsible, who's going to be accountable, who to consult, and who to inform. And so this RACI matrix helps an organization to basically have clarity around critical activities by assigning responsibility and describing communication needs. And so if we broke down RACI within an organization, and let's say all of us is in an organization and we're on the OE team and we're just trying to improve the organization effectiveness and how we operate and how we output and input, some of us may focus on responsibilities of what's important to the organization. And then we have an accountability metrics. Who's going to double check us? So that's the accountability people. Who are we going to consult with if we don't have the answers, right? And then who do we inform and to what level we inform them? And so that activity is about documenting who's going to be responsible, who's going to be accountable, who's going to be consulting, and who's going to be informed. And so RACI matrix says everyone is responsible for something. and everyone has to communicate what they're responsible for, to what degree, and to what level of effectiveness. So RACI is one of those matrix that's very, very, very good when it comes to OE. When you talk about talent development interventions, as we know, the best asset a company has is their human capital, right? So when we talk about OE, we're talking about talent and development, right? And we have to look at our interventions, and that's what this slide is speaking to. What are our interventions? How do we first figure out the best talent? How do we maximize our talent? Where do we find talent? Every organization right now in industry is competing for the same talent. And so if we're all on the OE team and we're part of the T&D team and we're trying to come up with interventions, all of us on this Zoom call will be having a meeting about how do we identify our needs? What does the organization need? Based off of financial forecasting, which we would have this information from the CFO, our manager, and the head of HR. We know what is to come at least 1 to 2 years out. If we don't know the 2 years, we know at least 1 year out. We know that we're a growing company, and now all of us on this Zoom call is having this conversation today, and we're trying to figure out what is going to be our talent development interventions. And so what we would do is sit down on the Zoom call and we would say, what is the needs? This is what we know to be true. We're going to have this much money available. We're going to know, we know that we're growing. We need to hire people in marketing, people in research and development. So-and-so is retiring. So-and-so we're going to have to part ways with. So-and-so is going to be out the country. So we're going to have to actually bring in, someone from Robert Half. Like, we have to identify what the intervention is for the organization when it comes to T&D. And we have to clarify those performance standards, identify competencies and deficiencies. So not only do we identify the competencies, we have to know the deficiencies as well. Again, we're talking about TD interventions, and then we have to develop the existing staff. Okay, well, if we want to hire so many people, but the budget don't call for that, then we have to do what we call develop our existing staff. We have to coordinate selection processes, develop a comprehensive workforce, and develop those individuals internally. And then we're going to build a talent pool. So what we know to be true is that we're going to have to hire 100 people in the next 6 months, but we're not ready to bring them on board now. So what we do is we develop a talent pool, right? And the worst thing an organization can do, the worst thing an organization can do, I say this so seriously, and I'm not making light of it. It is very disturbing because I just seen it as recent as last week. To know that a company is hiring, but they reach out to the candidates and they have these candidates in this holding pool. And they're making these candidates believe that they're going to actually bring them on board right now, when the truth of the matter is it's not going to take place till another 3 or 4 months from now. As an organization does themselves a disservice by doing that, and they're actually damaging their reputation, because people talk. And there's many forums where employees, candidates, terminated employees go to grieve their grievances. And so when you talk about talent and development interventions, if an organization knows they're going to be hiring, but they can't bring those people on now, they can't onboard them now until like 3rd quarter, it's best that a company communicates that when they're developing that talent pool. And that conversation will go something as simple as this. When you're building that talent pool, yes, you should be doing phone screens, you should be looking at resumes, but your conversation should not be in any area of promising them a job, promising that you're going to call them back even after the phone interview. The conversation is simple as, we're building a talent pool. We do not know, so to speak, when we can pull the trigger, but we wanted to kind of build a talent pool to see, what candidates are interested, what individuals we would like to interview in the coming weeks to months. But right now, we haven't even started the interview process. So I want to be honest with you, Mr. or Mrs. Candidate. That's how that conversation should go. That way you do not allow a candidate to think, even though they want to come work for your company, and even though you think they're the best person for the marketing position, you do not want to put people in a holding power. And that is like one of the most things as HR professionals that we should not do. We need to just be honest, because our time as HR people and the candidate's time is just as valuable. So I'm going to pause there. Any questions or comments so far? I got break on there, but we can keep going. I like to kind of pause and see how you're feeling. See if I got anything in the chat. You all want me to keep going?
Yeah.
Just nod your head. Yep. Okay, cool. All right. And I think I got another break coming up in like 7 or 8 slides. So we'll keep going. So again, we're talking about OE, organizational culture intervention. So now when we talk about looking at the intervention from a cultural standpoint, okay, so a few minutes ago, I talked about intervention from a T&D standpoint, right? Now let's talk about intervention from a cultural standpoint. describing the current culture of an organization. What does that look like? Okay. Again, this can be in conjunctions with the HR team, as well as the T&D team, the OE team, as well as we know, many positions under the DE&I space has been eliminated or non-existent, but most likely this would have started with them and ended with them, with everyone else being a part of the intervention. But now that we know that those positions are totally eliminated, gone, finito, now it's going to probably fall on the HR department or the OE department, the T&D department, or a combination of all three. Okay. And so what that looks like is when you're trying to look at the organizational intervention from a cultural standpoint, you have to sit down and have a conversation with the senior leaders. What is our current culture? You know, what do we say we are? One thing we say we are, but we exhibit a different behavior is not always one and the same. So identifying what that current culture is and then trying to assess what do we aspire to be? You know, what do we want to be known for? You know, we then have to go back to the basics, looking at our mission and our vision, our values, what we stand for, what type of talent are we trying to attract, our internal talent, what are we wanting them to feel about coming to work, right? And then being able to identify those gaps and conflicts, because there are always gaps when it comes to culture. And one thing about culture is that cultural, along with cultural competence, is a process, is not an endpoint. So in order for an organization to really intervene and try to understand their current culture, they have to be able to have their cultural competence to say, okay, not everyone thinks the same, feels the same, wants the same benefits, values the same type of work ethic. What is our current culture and what makes up our culture company? And what is it that we're aspiring to be? Right. And then having that cultural competence to say, okay, this is going to be a process. It's not an endpoint. It's a journey, right? But it's not an endpoint. It is a process to try to rebuild a culture, because on average, it takes anywhere between 5 to 8 years to rebuild a company's culture. So if they have a bad culture and they're known for just, you know, being whatever and inappropriate or highly inappropriate or whatever, in order for them to change their reputation, it can take on average between 5 to 8 years for a company to change their culture. So that's why it's so important for a company to really understand what is their culture, what are they aspiring to be, how to identify those gaps, and then develop some change initiatives. Because again, we're talking about intervention. The only way intervention can take place is first understanding where you are, where you're going, how you're going to get there, implement initiatives, come up with a strategy, and then strategy execution. It doesn't matter if you're having a conversation. You know, people have conversations all the time in their workplace and they never execute. So when you talk about intervention, it's just not about saying, hey, here's a good idea. You have to really be able to identify where you're going, how you're going to get there, why, when, how, and then try to figure out what do we put in place, what things do we need, what gaps do we need to identify. We need to put a strategy in place, and then we need to execute that strategy. That's where intervention goes well beyond just a conversation, right? And then being able to look at team or unit interventions. Again, this is about looking at the entire organization, how to build these processes and interventions. And again, this starts with developing a team identity. You know, what does the team look like? What is your team known for if you're over the marketing department or the IT department? You know, again, as a T&D OE people, right? And we're having this conversation tonight and we're trying to figure out what's the team and unit interventions. We literally have to go through each department to say, what is their identity? You know, how do we intervene? How do we get the best out of our people? How do we maximize their potential? We literally have to go play by play every department and try to figure out what is their identity. You know, what are the dysfunctional behaviors that we need to get rid of? You know, how do we redefine processes? How do we help them to not duplicate efforts and be able to remove conflicts and improve team coordination? How do we get them to build trust and help individuals when it comes to diverse individuals and diverse teams to overcome these cultural and geographical distances? Because whether the fact Dee and I stay around or not, that's not what I'm here to debate. What I am here to say is that regardless of what happens, right, wrong, or indifferent, we all live in a world which is driven by globalization. So we are going to interact, work with people that are different from us. So when you talk about team unit interventions, we have to be mindful of, hey, how do we build trust with people that we're not used to working with? Is it a particular department that has more issues than others? How do we look at those dysfunctional behaviors and intervene? Again, remember, OE, intervention. How do we intervene to help this team work more closely together, build trust, and improve their team coordination? Well, one thing we know to be true is we can do what we call team formation. I would encourage you to know these 4 levels. Team formation. The first level of team formation is forming. And I'm going to spend time on this slide because before I go any further, one question you may get hit with would be something like this. And last week we kind of talked about this. I kind of try to give you some high level examples. An example of a test question may be something like, in the area of team formation, level 3 is norming. And what would that consist of? And it may give you all the definitions of forming, storming, norming, and performing, but it's asking you to tell them what's the definition of norming. It's the third step. Or what's the second step? Or what's the first step in team formation? Or it may say, what is the final step in team formation? And so being able to understand some of these high level slides will be beneficial to you. But the first level in team formation is forming. This is where you have an employee that has low level of commitment and communication. An example of that would be for those of us or those of you that still hire, and do hiring and you bring someone on, they have a low level of commitment, low communication. Why is that? It isn't that they're not cut for the job. You hired them, you interviewed them, right? It's because they're trying to get used to their atmosphere, the culture, who they work with, their environment. So they're going to have a low level of commitment, low level of communication. But your responsibility as their manager, their leader, their HR person is to provide vision for them, describe expectation, and encourage them to persevere, even though it may be tough, right? Because everyone has a learning curve. So again, we're talking about team formation. Employee comes in, they're at the forming stage. Your job is to provide vision, encourage perseverance, set expectation. The next step is storming. This is where the employee moves from forming to storming. They now have a high level of conflict and dissent. What you're supposed to do and what you and I are supposed to do is enforce the ground rules, increase level of engagement, and provide coaching. See, here's the thing about the work that we do. Not everything deserves a write-up. Not everything deserves a termination. Some people just need to be coached. Some people have worked for bad leaders and some people have worked for good leaders. I've worked for both. The interesting part is when we talk about a new employee that comes through the door and they're at this low stage of being with the company, they went from forming to now storming. Our job is that when they make a mistake, don't question and say, oh, we shouldn't have hired them, or maybe they're not a good fit. No, we have to give them an opportunity to learn from their mistakes. But they learn from their mistakes when we bring it to them in a coaching aspect to say, hey, I noticed that this is the outcome you did when you performed that task. Can you talk to me a little bit about how you came to that conclusion? Because I would like to provide you some feedback. And they may say, oh, well, Shay, was it not the right thing? No, not quite. It wasn't. But I would love to hear how you arrived to that solution. Now, what I've done by coaching them through the fact that they made a mistake, right? That's not to a point where I need to terminate them. I provided an atmosphere where they now understand that they're going to receive coaching. So our job at this leader's role at the storming stage is to set those expectations, but try to coach them to increase levels of performance. The next level that an employee moves to is what we call norming. And this is kind of the growing sense of common direction. They now understand a little bit more about their defined responsibilities and their processes. And your job and my job is to facilitate communication and group decision making. Okay, so now they may not be coming to you as the HR person or their manager, so to speak, at the norming stage. You're now encouraging them, okay, have you checked with your group or have you checked with your coworker? Do you know if anyone else is experiencing this? You're encouraging them to now go back to their group, to engage with their group, to try to learn and understand the processes and the direction. And if you're wondering at what space or time do you know a person goes from forming, storming, and norming, I typically say, and other HR professionals may have a different take on it, forming for me is probably about the first 90 days to like 120 days, because they're trying to learn the organization, the culture, get comfortable with who they're working with. By the time they get to storming, it's probably around the 4 to 5 month mark, 6 month mark. And that can last for me, for the employees that I used to manage, probably anywhere between 3 to 6 months. Okay. So by the time they hit norming, it's kind of when they hit that 9 month space for me. Now, I'm not saying that they should just be running rogue and they're just completely, messing up. That's not what I mean. But they have a level foundation of what is expected. They're just having a hard time hitting the mark. They're doing it, but they're not doing it consistently. So by the time they get to norming, now I can have those conversations and say, okay, it's been about 3 or 4 or 5 months. How are you been feeling? Here's what I've noticed. How do you feel like you've been doing? And then by that time they would reach the norming stage, my conversation shifts a little different. So now it goes from coaching to, okay, okay, here's what I really need you to do, and I need you to really understand why this is important, and then tell me what would be in your way to prevent you from accomplishing it. Because by the time they get to norming, I'm going to turn them back around to either their manager or their coworkers and say, okay, what are we missing here? Because again, it may be a learning gap. Okay, so again, it's going to be derivative of every employee's life cycle. Every employee learns different. If you have somebody that's a low performer or a mediocre performer, the storming and norming stage is going to look different. If you have a high performer, it's going to look totally different. So just be mindful of that. So by the time the employee moves from the norming stage to the performing stage, this is where we want our employees to be. We want them to be at the high performing stage where we now are getting the maximized output from them, right? The highest level of productivity and self-direction, which means that they're barely going to ask questions. Not that we don't want them to, we just know that they're going to actually do and execute, right? They're probably going to be a high performer, or they've mastered it as a mediocre performer. Now they've leveled up to a high performer. You know, they understand what is value. They understand how to move forward. And what we're supposed to do, you and I, is to monitor, evaluate, foster improvement, motivate, celebrate their accomplishments. Because again, they started out at this forming stage and now they're a high performer. And that's why I shared with you all last week. One thing about an organization is that you're going to have those low performers, those mediocre performers, and those high performers. Our job as HR professionals is to help people elevate. There does come a time where you just have to part ways, but everyone should be given the same expectation, the same opportunity to improve, to be a high performer. We have some employees that's never given that opportunity. We don't even know what they're capable of, because we tend to go to our high performers because we know our high performers are going to always perform. But what we do to our high performers is that we tax them out. We tax them out. They either quit on us, they check out, they're still performing, but they don't seem as much as they're engaged, because you can be at work and not be engaged, right? And so one thing about what we have to remember as HR professionals is that we want every employee within the organization to have that same level of opportunity to be able to move up them ranks from low performer to mediocre to high performer. What questions do you have about team formation?
No questions.
Okay.
I
You
have
all
a
are quiet
question.
tonight. Sure, go for it.
So you were giving approximate time frames. How long usually does performing last, or is it supposed to be more permanent?
Yeah, so performing is one of those things, and I'll use I was a high performer, and when I looked at to answer your question, what you have to do at that level, when you have high performers, is that you have to keep them engaged. You have to give them, some of them want more responsibilities, some of them don't. I am burning up. Some of them want more responsibilities and some of them don't. What you have to do with people when they get to the high performing stage is to check in with them constantly, because high performers can get easily burnt out. And what we don't want to do is keep pounding things on them because we know that they're going to execute. And that was my experience in manufacturing HR, is that we knew those individuals, whether union or non-union, we knew that they would perform. What we did not know is that we were not checking in with them. And so what you have to do at that stage is make sure that you check in with your high performers and ask them, are you still enjoying what you're doing? Would you like to take on a different task instead of just throwing it at them because we know they can execute? And I was guilty of that. When I look back at my HR career, I was guilty of that. Now I encourage clients when I work with them is, hey, check in with them and ask them, do they want to take on more responsibility? So that's what you do when you get to the individuals that are basically, they're operating at a high level. You know, anything you give them, they're executing it. They ask very many questions. They're moving, they're rocking and grooving, you know, and people are seeing it. Leadership is seeing it. But we have to make sure that we check in with them because they will get burnt out. Right. So yeah, you just got to keep checking in with your high performers just to make sure they don't burn out and quit on you, because some of them do. And we had that happen in manufacturing early on in my career. You know, those high performers, HR manufacturing, as I mentioned, was very brutal, but we had high performers, those operators that was crunking out those widgets, right? Because we know that manufacturing is about how much you push out that door, input, output. And we were losing operators. They didn't care that we were paying them 40 to 50, 60 bucks an hour. They were burnt out. Right. Mm-hmm. And so that is one of the examples I would say, no matter what the industry, if you have high performers, to check in with them. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. No problem. So again, we're talking about team structure, OE, okay? We have to make sure that we have a criteria to shaping our team structure. So looking at the level skill set, the skill set of diversity, the authority dispersion, and the permanence, right? This makes up the team structure, and being able to look at a criteria to try to determine what is the level of skill set for our team, what's missing, do we have a diverse individual? And this, again, we're talking about OE, okay? Organizational effectiveness. We're talking about all of this. Every department we would have to break down to look at the criteria for the IT department, accounting department, so-and-so department, marketing department. This is what OE does, is we're looking at all of these things. Again, we're talking about OE intervention. We have to be able to look at the team dynamics and what type of skill set that each department had in order to look at interventions to improve the organizational effectiveness. And then looking at the group dynamics, task roles, social roles, dysfunctional roles, do we have individuals that are doing things they shouldn't be doing? Are they doing things that someone asked them to do, but we're not aware of, right? What's their responsibilities? What are they tasked with? And not only are you tasked with it, are you executing it? See, that's the thing about the work that we do. There are plenty of people that will take things on, like continually fill up their plate, right? They'll keep piling things on. They can do this, they can do that. But very few people are able to long-term sustainable execute all those things that we put on their plate. And that's why, again, going back to the team formation, checking in with your high performers, because everyone's human. We're all humanly flawed. But what happens in organizations is that we look at this group dynamics and we forget to really find out, is there type of roles that are cross-functioning? Are they crossing over? Are they overlapping? Are we duplicating efforts? Are there some roles that's just totally dysfunctional that we need to get away from? These are just things that we have to consider when we talk about the group dynamics. And then we talk about building activities. Again, no one does this work in isolation. I've always said that. I will continue to say that. It doesn't matter. You and I as HR professionals, we don't do our job in isolation. The CEO doesn't do his job in isolation. The marketing department doesn't do their job in isolation. What I'm saying is that we all have to contribute to the organizational effectiveness from the level where we sit and stand. So whether you're marketing or whether you're IT, whether you're HR or whether you're sales, everyone has to contribute to this overall effectiveness of team building, and then being able to look at the team building activities from an OE standpoint, being able to focus on what are the goals and priorities, what are the processes, what is the roles and responsibilities, and then those interpersonal relationships that make up the team dynamic. Because more often than not, if a team has a hard time trying to move forward, execute, and perform their jobs, that is a bigger problem that HR really sometimes don't pay attention to, because it tends to break down the entire environment of the organization when you have a whole department or a group of individuals that just cannot see eye to eye, and no one have stepped in intervention to try to figure out how to close that gap. Because again, you don't have to like everyone you work with. But we all owe each other a certain level of dignity and respect. You don't have to like everyone you work with. You don't have to agree with everyone, right? You don't even have to agree with your manager, so to speak, right? But you owe your authority leader, the manager, your coworker, and yourself a level of dignity and respect to try to at least be effective and impactful when it comes to the job that you do and where you sit and stand in your everyday activity. Because that's the thing. I tell people all the time, and I told the people that work for me, I want you to be effective and impactful. I need you to try to figure out how to do that simultaneously. And me as your leader, I'm going to ask you, what is it that you need for me to be successful? And then I'm going to actually give you the autonomy to figure it out for yourself in terms of, you can do this. I'm gonna give you everything you need, all the resources, all the support, all the coaching, all my time. We'll make it happen. But when it comes to team building, you have to contribute to the team environment in order for it to be an effective team building and an effective environment for all. It is not done in isolation. All right, so we're at our knowledge question number 1, and I'm gonna pull my phone because Patrick gave me the answer. So we're gonna walk through these. And for those of you that wasn't with us last week, basically I read the question, or we read the question, then we read it again, and then we'll figure out basically which answers, and Brent, I believe you and a few others wasn't with us, but typically what happens, as I shared last week, when it comes to the SHRM exam, there always is going to be one question that's just not going to make sense. One answer, excuse me, is just not going to make sense. There's always going to be the right answer and the best answer. And so what we've been doing walking through these questions last week and today is that we're going to eliminate what we know to be true. We're just going to get rid of the one that does not make sense. And then we're going to narrow it down to 2 of the best answers. And of those 2 answers, we know, according to SHRM Think, is going to be the right answer and the best answer. So that's what we're going to do. All right, so which organizational structure is best suited for an international organization that operates across several distinct industries in all regions in which it maintains a presence? Which organizational structure? So what we know to be true is we're looking for a structure. Which organizational structure is best suited for an international organization that operates across several distinct industries in all regions in which it maintains presence? Tell me 1 or 2 that we can get rid of off the bat.
I feel like we could get rid of product structure.
Okay. Why do you think that?
I could be reading it wrong, but it says distinct industries in all regions. So the products could be slightly different.
I can see that. Okay. So you think product. Okay. Anyone else? I would say I would get rid of functional, because again, we're looking for a structure. Indeed, I would say get rid of functional. Brent, what are your thoughts? Andrea?
With the reading part, or just reading through it, decentralized, and I say that, I don't even remember if that was one of them or not, but I'm thinking decentralized because it said multiple areas across several distinct industries. That's why I was thinking decentralized.
Okay. Okay. All right. Andrea, what are your thoughts?
Those are the ones that are hardest for me.
Okay.
I was thinking decentralized as well, just because there's different functions and they could all basically be in charge of decision making, but not sure.
That's okay. That's what we're here to learn. So the correct answer actually is product structure.
Oh.
And since I don't have the facilitator guide in front of me to explain why SHRM chose that, make a note to yourself, because again, I know these type of structures are hard, Andrea, to kind of distinguish what's the difference between a matrix and a product structure. But for this particular question, the correct answer is product structure. And so again, when you're taking your exam and you're reading these questions, always pay attention to that first sentence. In this case, it says which organizational structure, or it may say what's the first step in the team formation, and you will know that, hey, you know where to start. So that's the answer for this one, product structure. All right, let's try this next one.
If it's helpful, it's on page 61. I just found it in
Thank
our
you.
books. Yeah. Hey, you
Perfect.
never know.
Yeah, please help us out. Yeah. I was sharing with Patrick, doing virtual versus in person. I normally have the facilitator guide that I print off and everything. So it's all good, but at least you know where to find it and study it. So thank you for that, Brent. That's cool.
Yeah.
The next one is, okay, so here's an example of what I said you may see on an exam. In this case, they said during which stage, or they may say what's the first step, but here's a prime example for this next question. During which stage of Tuckman's team development process is a leader most responsible for facilitating communication and group decision? During which stage of Tuckman's team development process, which is the team formation?
We
Is
can
a leader
forming. We
Okay.
can take it off.
You say forming?
Like take it off.
Okay. All right. Any other thoughts? She says forming.
It's norming. That's the third stage.
Okay. Yeah.
It's norming, yes. Which stage of Tuckman's team development? And I think I shared with you all last week when they kind of give you these 3 and 4 step processes. And in this case, this is the team formation. Also try to tie the owners to it. In this case, Tuckman's, because they'll ask you, who created team formation, and they'll list Tuckman and 3 other people, Maslow hierarchy. They may list something crazy, and you're like, okay, I don't know who created. I know what the 4 steps are, but I don't know who created. So also as you're studying, try to be mindful. And like I said, I shared with them last week, Brent, for me and my study group, we came up with acronyms, to try to remember some of these, because it was so many different levels when it came to these different theories, Maslow hierarchy of needs, and Tuckman, and, training and development, and all these other people. We had to come up with acronyms. So in this case, try to tie both the question and their steps to who created it. In this case, team formation was created by Tuckman. So if I had to study with you all, I would say to myself, team formation, T for the T, Tuckman for the T. That's who created TNT. Tuckman created team formation. That's how I studied it, in order to remember some of these, because there's so many theories that they're going to throw at you. Fiedler's theories, there's so many that you're coming across, and they will ask you who created this theory. And if you just know the answer, but you don't know who created it, you may miss that question on the exam. So, okay. All right, next question is, which of the following talent development tasks is associated with talent development intervention activity directed towards developing existing staff? I'm laughing because this is what they do to throw you off. But we know to be true is we're looking for a talent development task based off of this first part of this question. Which of the following talent development tasks is associated with a talent development intervention activity directed toward developing as existing staff? Which 1 or 2 can we eliminate off top?
I think we can eliminate D.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It has nothing to do with it. Absolutely. Okay, so we'll eliminate D. What's another one we can eliminate?
C.
Yeah.
Tell me why C. C is actually the answer.
Oh.
Yeah, that's what we meant.
There you go. We'll go with that. We got the right answer. We'll go with C, coordinate selection process. And so as you can see with these questions, this is what you will face on the real exam. They'll throw something in there that doesn't matter. But again, what you would probably need to understand through your studying is understanding those intervention activities, which was on the previous a couple slides back. So understanding that there's tasks tied to talent development intervention activities. We got tasks and we got activities tied to OE development activities. Sorry, I know that's a lot, but it's all talent development. But we know that ensure current job descriptions does not have nothing to do with talent development tasks. Communicating performance expectations has nothing to do with talent development activities. Okay, that's a performance conversation, not talent development. Identifying competency deficiencies, yeah, possibly, and then coordinating selection process. So as you see, there's 2 that could really work. B and C could be between a winner, right? We know A and D is totally out. So again, when you're walking through these examples and in your portal at home, when you're studying these, don't beat yourself up, give yourself some grace, but just say 1 is not going to be it. 2 are going to probably be between. It's going to be 1 that's 1 answer, for sure answer, and 1 is the best answer. And Sharon wants you to pick the for sure answer. So.
Oh, you didn't eat?
Okay. All right. So we're at break now. Would you all like me to keep going, or you're good? You tell me, because we're already at workforce management.
I'm fine with either.
Okay, keep going. You want a break?
We can keep going.
Okay, because here's the thing. Once I get through this, I'm actually done, and I'm not a facilitator that believes in just keeping you just to keep you. So once I get through this and you're feeling comfortable and you want to log off, we will do that. Okay, and you can have back some of your evening. So we'll jump into workforce management. So let's talk about workforce management. It's so important. As we know, companies have to do what we call workforce planning. We know that. And so when you talk about workforce planning, that consists of an organization analyzing their workforce and determining steps for the future. Okay, they're going to do this in conjunction with the CFO, financial forecasting, accounting individuals. These people, we are all going to sit at the table, right? And we're going to have a conversation about what is the future of the organization and what type of workforce do we need? And that's what workforce planning does, is that you're going to process, looking at analyzing the entire organization, the entire organization's workforce. And this also includes looking at who's retiring, who you're going to part ways with, meaning, you know, are you going to have to eliminate or cut jobs? You know, all this goes into that. Again, as we know, terminating people is not something that just happens overnight. This stuff is done well in advance before the employees even know about it, right? But again, workforce planning is looking at the organization's workforce and then looking at how do you find human capital to align with where the business is going. That is the gist of workforce planning. So if you go back to my same example is, hey, all of us is on the Zoom call. We know our company ABC is going to be hired in the near future. Our job is, we've already analyzed the workforce. We know that we need to hire 100 people. So now me, you, Andrea, Brent, Kelly, we got to sit down and say, okay, we got to find some human capital to align with where the company is going. What we are doing is we're exercising workforce planning. That's what we're doing. Okay. And there's analysis that goes into that. Okay. There's particular areas that we have to focus on. We have to have a strategic focus. Okay. Where are we going? Again, what's that when, why, how we're going to get there? What current workforce capital do we have available to us, and how many people we got to hire? Well, based off of the CFO, he's told us, hey, we got to hire 100 people. Okay. So all of us are on this call trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to strategically do this? We have to be strategically focused and looking at the analysis of the workforce analysis. And this is what it consists of, 6 steps. The workforce analysis consists of 6 steps: strategic focus, supply analysis, demand analysis, gap analysis, solution analysis, and evaluating the workforce planning impact. Let me give you some context. We're doing this on Zoom right now. We already know 100 people. We're strategically focused on the fact that we have to find some human capital. We know we can't bring them on. Remember, we talked about that. We can't bring them on right now. We probably gonna need to hire them in the 4th quarter. The expectation from the head of HR have told all of us, we need to have all of these 100 people onboarded by September 1. This stuff is real, as we know. So that means that all of us tonight have to continue to work at this on a weekly basis so that we're not dragging and lagging behind the expectation. If we are expected to have 100 people onboarded walking through the door September 1, that means that we have to start this analysis probably in the next 30 days. And we have to build our talent pool within the next 30 days. But again, we're not lying to the candidates. We're not lying to them. We're not telling them that they're going to start May 15th. What we're doing is we're going to start the process. So what are we doing? We're looking at what supply do we have available to us. We know we got to be strategically focused. We got to have everybody in the door, ready, on payroll, September 1, walking through the door, ready to hit the ground running 10 toes down. We have to start the supply analysis. What supply do we currently have available? The next thing is what's in demand. How are we going to find these people? We know that we're all competing for the same talent. We know that every industry is looking for the same talent, and all of us together, because we're part of the workforce planning team, right? Because we're doing workforce planning, we have to figure out how are we going to get these people, and then how do we make sure we hit that demand? The demand is 100 people. Now, remember, when we talk about hiring 100 people, there's a very good chance that probably 1/3 of them probably won't show up even on the first day. So that means that we really need to really have 100 people hired, but some people in the backdrop too, right? So looking at that demand analysis, once we determine that, what's our gap? What's the gap we need to fill, right? You know, how many do we need for the marketing department? How do we need for this department? Filling the gap analysis and then looking at the solution to this. Again, this is all part of workforce analysis. And then being able to evaluate that workforce and look at the impact that if we're going to have everyone by September 1st. Because again, along the lines, we know our leader is going to be checking in with us, right? They're going to be asking us every week, how are you all coming? You know, have you found any people? What type of supply do you have? You know, what's the demand out there? You know, is there a particular of those 100 positions? Is there a particular high skilled position that we have to go probably outside of the Midwest to find? You know, again, because there's certain skill sets for certain jobs, right? So do we have to go looking for this particular skill set? You know, where are we going to find them if that plays into it? Do we have to bring them in to interview? Are they coming from a different part of the world? You know, again, and what we can do to kind of help us with this is we can start internally. We can go to our HR VP and say, hey, you know, we would like to run, you know, a quick internal letter that says, hey, can you refer some people? You refer some people, we'll give you $1,500. You know, how much do we have available in our budget to try to find people to refer employees? So a referral program, 500, 1,500, what does that look like? So that can help us fill that 100-person expectation. But what we're doing is basically workforce planning. We have to look at workforce analysis, which consists of 6 different areas: strategic, supply, demand, gap, solutions, and then evaluate that workforce planning impact. Any questions about that? So if we were studying together, we know that the workforce analysis has 6 steps. Point blank period. That's what we know to be true. If we were studying and we got a question, we know that the workforce analysis areas consist of 6 areas. So we know that to be true. When we talk about looking at some of these forecasting tools, right, we have to be able to look at one being supply analysis. Again, we have to look at what are we looking at? What is our turnover analysis? Because again, as we mentioned, we're hiring 100 people, but we know probably at least 1/3 of them either not going to show up or probably going to quit within the first week, or maybe they were entertaining another company and that company offered them something better and they quit on us on the 3rd day. We have to be able to look at some of the trends as it relates to the supply. So again, looking at the supply analysis, which is derivative of turnover analysis. Again, these are forecasting tools. So again, if we were studying together, we know supply analysis is a forecasting tool that we have available to us in our toolbox. Another one is demand analysis, which we talked about. Again, remember, demand analysis is one of our 6 areas of workforce analysis. And so we have to be able to look at both judgmental and statistical forecast when we're talking about looking at the demand. And why we look at the demand, we're looking at it from, hey, from a judgmental standpoint, let's look at the past and present to predict our future needs. You know, what happened last time we hired a bunch of people in bulk? Or, you know, what happened when we were told we had to hire so many people in a short amount of time within 6 months? Like, what does past and present look like for us from a judgmental standpoint? Because what we're exercising is what we call demand analysis. We have to look at the variety of it and estimate how we're going to execute these 100 people. We're also going to take into consideration statistical forecast, that regression analysis. And we always have to say, what if? What if we can't find 100 people, which we can't tell our HR people that we're not going to find 100 people, but we may ask ourselves that, well, what if? Okay. And we have to ask ourselves the what ifs, like, okay, we bring in 100 people. How many of them are going to stay within those first 6 months? Right. What happens? What if this? What if that? We always have to ask ourselves, when we talk about demand analysis, you always have to ask yourself, what if? Remaining optimistic, but always ask yourself, what if? What if this? Okay, an example of that is, how about we have 100 people? Okay, let's go a little further here. I'm a person that likes to think outside the box. Let's say we find our 100 people, you all. We've been spending our time on Zoom every day at work. Now we're talking at work now. We're figuring this out. Hey, we got our 100 people. But what happens if we get hit with another pandemic? What if? What do we do with those people? How do we pivot? Again, we would do this in conjunction with our VP of HR, who we report to, but that is, again, what ifs. You have to be what ifs. What if the people that we hired, we pay for them to relocate and all of a sudden they get hit with a sickness or illness and he was going to be the director of marketing? What if? Do we have a backup to replace him? He's part of the 100 people. We're creating a whole new marketing department. What if? So again, being able, when you talk about workforce planning, which I've been a part of that, you always have to ask, what if? Again, you're not being negative. You want to try to address the unknowns. It's not good for any company to act like the unknowns don't exist. You have to ask yourself, what if? We hire these people, a pandemic happened, what happens now? What if? Again, looking at this gap analysis, you know, being able to compare that supply and demand to try to identify staffing differences and competencies needed for the future. Again, we're doing workforce planning. Part of our workforce planning areas, which is 6 of them, gap analysis is one of them. So now we're talking about the gap. And the gap is what we need versus what we have on hand. What we demand, 100 people, how many people are going to qualify? we have and need 100 people, but really supply wise, these candidates is not hitting the mark. Supply and demand, when you talk about the gap, where you're looking at what is the supply that you have and what is your demand. The supply is right now, we don't have any because we haven't started recruiting. The demand is we need 100 people. Now we need to figure out how do we close that gap? And how do we not only hire someone, not for now, but we need to hire someone for the future. I've always been a firm believer when I've hired in my past HR career. I'm gonna keep saying past like I don't do it anymore. I just don't work in corporate America. But when I did it in corporate America, I never hired anyone. It didn't matter to me if they were an executive admin. I never hired them for the job that they were hiring for. Never, 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 never. I always hired them for where I wanted them to go and the potential that they had. And I was always one of those ones that was very generous with hiring people. I never gave them the bare minimum. I never tried to shortchange them because I looked at it from a strategic level. I'm like, I'm hiring you to be an HR generalist, but really what I probably need you to be down the line based off of your skill set is probably a head of an HR department or head of talent and D. And so not only that is that looking at how to identify those needs and competencies that's needed for the future. That's what gap analysis is. As HR professionals, we should never, ever want to hire people strictly for the job that we are interviewing for. So in our same example, 100 people, we should be at least looking at majority of those 100 people in terms of how they can benefit the company long term. Whether they stay with us or not doesn't have anything to do with us, but we're preparing them and we're thinking about what's needed for the future. So that's what gap analysis is, looking at that skill set, the distribution, the diversity of thought, the time, the cost. Again, we're doing that succession planning. Not hiring those 100 people for the fact we need them to start for the marketing department on September 1, but what if some of them can be, prepared for future leadership within the company? Because what that does, it makes our job easier. Because if a position comes open, we don't have to really go outside looking at supply. We can look internally to see who may qualify based off of their skill set, based off of how they're performing, based off of how they've committed and valued themselves within the organization. Again, you got to look at your supply and demand, but that's what I do as an HR person. And when I work with clients, I encourage them from a subject matter expert standpoint to do that as well. Don't just hire someone just for now. Look at where they can be for your organization, because you never know. Things happen to life. Life be life for everybody. Some people's family, something happens, they can't return. Somebody, God forbid, died in a car accident, or maybe a baby was sick, and that stuff happens for real, right? And you have to be able to look internally and say, okay, we didn't expect this to happen, but who do we have in place, succession planning, that can fill that position? So that's my encouragement to you. But also looking at these prioritizing gaps, permanence, looking at impact, looking at evidence, and then root cause when you're talking about trying to close those gaps when it comes to looking at workforce planning. I would encourage you to understand what's on this slide, because you may get asked a question about prioritizing gaps when it comes to workforce planning. And then, of course, we talked about solution analysis. Again, we're still on this whole 6 tier of workforce analysis. It has 6 areas, and solution analysis, again, is one of them. And so, again, you're looking at how to build up this human capital. Again, going back to those 100 people that we need to hire. How do we redeploy? How do we train them? How are we going to develop them? How are we going to recruit and hire? Are we going to have to outsource? What are we going to do? We got to lease some of the stuff for their desk. All that stuff comes into play, especially if it's a new department. We have to already know ahead of time where they're going to be sitting. Is some of these going to be W-2 employees, or going to be 1099, or are we going to have to hire consultants? Like, all this goes into how we're going to look at workforce planning. Because believe it or not, there may come a time where, a company interviews and they cannot find a particular skill set. That more oftentimes than not, they'll have to hire a consultant. Especially if it's a position within an organization that is very important and very viable to the success of the organization. Sometimes when you cannot find it in a candidate, you may have to hire a consultant. Yeah, you're going to pay a little more, but here's the benefit of a consultant, right? You don't have to pay them benefits, right? You don't have to pay them benefits. They're just there to serve until you can fill the gap to find a permanent W-2 employee. So if this was us trying to figure out these 100 people and we're short 3 people, right? We're at 97 and we just cannot find these other 3, but we realize the 3 has a particular skill set. We may need to go back to our VP of HR and say, okay, can we at least outsource this, right, until we can find a permanent W-2 employee? Because there's benefits, advantages, and disadvantages to hiring a consultant. Yeah, they're going to charge a little more. Yeah, we do charge a little more, but you ain't got to pay us benefits. You know, you don't have to, if you tell us, if you hire us, meaning us consultants, you hire us to do a 3-month job, that's it. You know, we don't, you know, we don't come back after 3 months, but we know that the two highest expenses of an organization is their salary and wages. So if you're hiring a permanent W-2 employee, you know, all those 100 people we're hiring, we got to pay them salary and wages, benefits, 401k, perks, all of that. Well, with the consultant, they're going to fill that gap for you, and you've helped, basically you've solved the problem. Solution analysis, you've solved that problem until you can find a W-2 employee. Because what you're doing is you want to bridge that gap and try to bring in someone that can provide added value to your organization to enhance the organization until you can find those permanent employees. Okay, you need a break? Want to take a 5? Nope. Okay, what time is it? Let's see. Oh, we grooving. We grooving. Y'all sure you want me to keep going? Okay. All right. Well, we're almost, when I get on the end of this, we just have 3 questions. So hopefully we'll be done by 7, and I will give you back some of your time. And that's always a good thing. So let's talk about staffing plan real quick. So we just got done talking about OE, organizational effectiveness. We talked about workforce planning. We talked about the 6 areas of workforce analysis. We talked about the importance of organizational effectiveness and intervention. And again, as we know, organizational effectiveness is looking at the organization from a high level view, bird's eye view, and being able to look at risks, behaviors, dysfunctionals, and improve the organization so that the organization can continue to be functional and be profitable, okay? Workforce planning is trying to figure out, okay, what is it that we need now? What is it that we're gonna need in the future? And then how we're gonna get there. The what, why, how, and what if. Okay, so now let's talk about staffing planning. We know staffing planning consists of looking at our stakeholders and resources needed. So the short of it is our organization, as we know, is the management, HR management, other units, and union leadership. Okay, so an organization, whether they're union or non-union. Stakeholders, you know, private equity is going to be your board of directors, your investors. So every company has stakeholders, okay? But regardless of the industry, whether it's manufacturing, logistics, education, hospitality, every organization have to look at their resources, their budget, looking at their scorecard. Again, I told you you can turn just about anything into a scorecard. As we know in HR, HR has a scorecard. Marketing can have a scorecard, but every organization has a department that has a budget. Looking at that budget, looking at the project schedule. Again, going back to our example of us happen to hire 100 people, right? All of us on here is the workforce planning team. You know, what's our budget? You know, how are we going to execute this thing by September 1 and get everybody you know, into the system, payroll process, you know, I-9 completed, you know, where they're going to sit, their badge, their computer, their cell phones if applicable. If they're a VP or a director, you know, get them access to their American Express card, like all the resources, right? This is all the stuff we have to do when we talk about workforce planning. We talk about staffing planning, you have to be able to understand what is the expectation of the stakeholders and circumstances. What resources do we have available to us for these 100 people? Again, that equipment, the facilities, the material, and logistics support. You know, 100 people is a lot to have start on September 1. That's a lot of people, right? And they're all different levels of the organization. Some are entry level, some are mid level, right? Some is high level senior leadership, like a director and a manager, you know, assistant director, like all of this stuff is all important. And we have to be able to look at our resources when we talk about staffing planning. When a company has to be able to look at their staffing and look at continuous improvement, they have to first start here. Define criteria and standards, okay? This is what a staff plan looks like when you talk about continuous improvement. Define the criteria and the standards. Once you define it, you have to adjust the criteria and the standards. From there, you need to analyze the process for efficiency and integration. After that, you want to define and implement related processes. From there, you want to build the problem, identify and solve processes. You do have to collect data so that you can understand what lessons you learned along the way. Not only that, once it's been executed, you have to monitor it and look at it from a quality standpoint and look at it and monitor it from an ongoing basis, and then engage in open dialogue with senior leadership to see how you can improve it. So this right here is a snapshot in time about a staff plan continuous improvement. We talk about flexible staffing, okay? Flexible staffing is another alternative, you all catch that, alternative to recruiting sources and workers who are not regular employees. So again, going back to me talking about consultants such as myself, you know, that's an alternative to organizations, again, not hiring people like us, right, to give us vacation and benefits and all of that. Flexible staffing, there's many options out there, right? You know, what does it look like? Again, if we don't hit those 100 people, do we need to bring in flexible staffing? Because what we don't want to tell our senior leader, VP, is that we didn't hire 100 people. We have to always consider the what if, right? We have to figure out what if, look at our sources, and look at how we're going to execute what is expected of us. As we know, as all HR professionals on this Zoom call, we know that the worst thing we can ever tell our manager is we didn't do it. And I don't think many of us on here has had to say that too many times, at least I haven't. There's always a workaround, right? So when you look at flexible staffing, it's an alternative to recruiting, okay? Looking at where they might be used, you know, again, shortage of available employees for open positions, you know, seasonal peak demands, as we know retail does that. They kind of hire all these people during the peak of the holiday, and then they kind of let them go, you know, operational upturns and downturns, you know, looking at that head count, and then special projects that demand specific skills. There does come a time where organizations do have to hire consultants or a consulting firm because there are a specific skill set that they cannot find within their organization. So that's another option, again, to flexible staffing. When you talk about those different types of flexible staffing, it's going to be derivative by the organization, but you have temporary assignments, temporary employees, interns, on-call workers, part-time employees, job sharing, seasonal workers, phased out retirement, where you have some people that retired and they walked out the door with all that institutional knowledge, right? And maybe you didn't capture it into an employee handbook or SOP, and you may have to call them because they offered to come back after retirement to help out people that you replaced them with. Again, looking at those individuals that were phased out of retirement. Again, these are other options that's available. Or you can look at what companies do with me and other people that I work alongside as consultants, is that, you know, look, retainer, you know, they have some of us on retainer, you know, where they only call us when they need us to help them solve a problem, or maybe they're dealing with benefits, or maybe they're a department of 2 people. Maybe it's the VP and the HR manager, and she has to do everything. So, you know, having someone as a retainer. So these are all flexible staffing options that's available to organization. And then sometimes you just have to outsource it, right? You know, you just may have to outsource it and kind of look at what we call that administration outsource, where you again have those contract workers, whether it be consultants or individuals on a retainer basis. So what are some of the type of flexible staffing arrangements? I've kind of already touched on them. Payrolling. Again, some people outsource their payroll, employee lease and PEO, okay? Attempt to lease or outsourcing of managed services. You know, what we call co-employment or joint employment now, where you just kind of summarize legal relationships and the rights and obligations when it comes to certain staffing arrangements, just making sure there is clear-cut expectation from the organization to the outside staffing arrangements, whether that's the PEO, the payrolling, the consultant, you know, the retainer person that you've hired to help you with HR, just making sure there's a clear cut distinction, between what they're expected to do and what they are thinking they're going to be doing. That's kind of where it kind of gets kind of muddy, is because people don't really understand what the organization need, and then the organization doesn't really understand the limitation that a consultant can have when they're contributing from a staffing arrangement standpoint. Independent contractors, IC as I call them, also known as consultants and freelancers, okay? So, you know, maybe being seen as employees depending on their characteristics or agreement. You know, some companies will have consultants and freelancers on a monthly basis, retainer basis. They may give them a 1-year contract, a 6-month contract, a 3-week contract. It's whatever they need them to do, but just understanding that independent contractors, basically they own the work, meaning they get the work done according to the jurisdiction here in Indiana, you know, and every state is different. But according to the IRS, the IC says, hey, independent contractor, they own the work, you know, but the company doesn't control the work to that aspect. Yeah, you hire, you know, IC like me or someone to do something, I'm going to do it and execute it, you know, but to, you know, like it is as a W-2 employee where you're constantly checking in and asking them, is it done yet? And all of that. It's a whole different ballgame when you're dealing with a consultant or a freelancer, because we control our work, but we still have to answer to you as a company because you hired us. Because what it really says is that as long as I execute it, it doesn't matter really how I get it done, right? As long as I make sure that I understand by needs assessment, what your expectation is, when you need it, how you need it done, why you need it done. Do you need me to have a meeting with leadership and explain, my process? Again, we should be checking in with you. Don't misunderstand me. It shouldn't be that kind of hands off when you're dealing with flexible staffing arrangements. You should be able to conversate, meet with, talk to your consultant or your flexible staffing arrangement person or persons, just to make sure that they're on board with what you expect. Again, so don't misunderstand me. It's just the fact that that whole kind of hovering over them is different when they're an IC versus a W-2 employee. And then, of course, independent contractors, should help develop processes and guidelines for using independent contractors. Again, you all as a company, every company should have a written policy on how they develop, how they handle, how they pay independent contractors, how they want the contractors to communicate with them when they're hired. All of this should be a policy. Again, as I shared with you all last week, there's a difference between a best practice and a policy. A best practice has nothing to do with the letter of the law. What they look at is what's in your policy. We get that you have a best practice, but if something ever happened litigation wise, the first thing a judge and a lawyer is going to say is, what is your policy? We got that you got a best practice, but a best practice and policy is not one and the same. Okay. So again, it's very important that you all have a clear written distinction on how you handle flexible staffing, such as IC independent contractors. When you look at these guidelines, okay, just making sure that you have guidelines and you communicate that. Make sure you be cautious, standard forms, ensure that you very clear. I used to use Robert Half a lot when I was in corporate HR, before branching out on my own. And I had to make sure that I looked at their contracts, because Robert Half was always changing up a little bit of kind of their stipulations. They were extremely high, so it was like 30%. What they was charging us, but nevertheless, making sure that you negotiate competitive pricing if you and your company have to step out and find, flexible staffing. One thing about Robert Half's and all these great companies that's out there, they do have a standard flat fee that they charge you on top of, all these additional fees, versus if you hire an independent contractor and freelancer, you cut out the middleman, so if you're the HR manager or the VP and you need someone to come in and do something, in your department or whatever, if you find a certified HR professional, whether it's, SHRM or what have you, but they're certified, you and that person can negotiate rates. And it's basically, you cut out the middleman. When you deal with, these other companies, the great Robert Half's and all of them, there's a middleman, and there's a lot of fees attached to that. And so you just want to make sure that you read it and understand the clarity of it. Okay. And then make sure that you consider an ADR provision, make sure you have a simple out procedure, and make sure that you negotiate clear and precise provisions as far as it relates to the expiration, the start and the end date of the assignment. When you talk about drivers of restructuring, okay, restructuring is something that happens in organizations. We know that term is being used now. When you're looking at people that's losing their jobs and stuff like that, you hear that term restructuring. But one thing about it is that restructuring first starts with strategy. What is the strategy, the current strategy? What's the new strategy? And then what's the current business structure, business model? What's the existing business model? What's the new business model when you talk about structure? And then looking at downsizing and expansion. I get asked the question all the time, how does a company lay off, downsize, and then turn around and hire and expand? Well, it happens all the time. That's nothing new under the sun. Nothing that's happening in the world that I've seen from my position as I sit and stand, none of this stuff is new to me, because if we go back all the way back to the days in the early early 2000s, where we had organizations that were just laying off in droves, and then they'll turn around and hire people. This is nothing new, but this is what restructuring looks like. It starts with strategy, that existing strategy. What's our new strategy? Looking at structure. What's our current structure? What's our new structure? Okay, based off of financial planning and the CFO and accounting and the board of directors, we're gonna have to downsize. Okay, what does that look like? Are we wiping out a whole department? Are we wiping out 500 people? Are we wiping out 33% of our workforce? Are we wiping out 10% of our workforce? We know that when we fire those people and terminate them, we gain a lot of money in terms, even though it's true, because we no longer have to pay for benefits and salaries and wages. Again, the number two big expenses of an organization is their salary and wages. So when I terminate or I get rid of 10,000 people in my workforce, I now have saved the company, right, an astronomical amount of money. But then we also think and know we want to expand down the line. So what does that restructuring look like? So again, these are drivers of restructuring. What are some of the forms of restructuring? Redistribution, looking at the decision-making authority, what is it going to look like? Decentralizing HR, do we do downward or forward? What is it going to look like? Believe it or not, one growth strategy, and you might want to remember this, one growth strategy of an organization is M&A, mergers and acquisitions. That is a growth strategy where companies basically, as we know, mergers and acquisition, where they merge together. Okay, they look at merger and divestiture. This is actually a growth strategy. I worked for a tech company as a consultant 2 years ago, and I was filling in for the lady. She was out on maternity leave. She was the VP of HR, so she hired me as a senior HR manager, but had her title too. So at the end of my signature description, it had senior HR, VP of HR, contractor. But nevertheless, that company that I worked for had 30 companies under one umbrella because it was a private equity firm. Their growth strategies was merger and acquisitions. So what they were doing is they will buy companies and they will sell them off. They will buy companies and sell and buy out the CEO or whoever owned it. And then they will turn around and reinvest it. So that is a growth strategy. Mergers and acquisition is a growth strategy. But when you look at it, you have to look at everything. So when you take on a company or they merge or you acquire a company, you get along with that, their payroll, their employees, everything technological. You have to look at the finances. There's so many attorneys involved in M&A. The pages is astronomical. I think I seen one that was over 100 pages. I mean, for the board of directors and the lawyers to look over. I mean, this stuff is like crazy, right? But it's a growth strategy, but it's part of restructuring, mergers and acquisition. And then, of course, we all know RIF, reduction in force. We know what that looks like. We know that according to the Department of Labor, companies have to utilize the WARN Act, right? They have to at least give a 60-day notice, right? This does not apply to the federal government. I'm just talking about anything outside of the federal government. But we know when it comes to a reduction in force, according to the Department of Labor, they have to utilize the WARN Act, and they have to give people a notice that they're going to do a reduction in force that is required by law. Looking at talent management, okay, development, integration of HR processes, how we're going to retain the skills, the abilities, and employees to meet future organizational needs. So we went earlier from talking about OE, organizational effectiveness, to talking about talent and development, where we're developing our talent. Now we got to manage that talent, right? Looking at the skills, the abilities, and employees to meet organizational needs. And so in order for us to understand that, we have to look at the implications of what the organization and business strategy is. I will say this to every last one of you. It doesn't matter what position you operate in within your current organization, whether you're a marketing person, IT person, an HR person, whatever it may be, right? What you have to make sure is that everything you do as HR professionals and everything your employees and departments do is that it has to contribute to the overall success of the organization's business strategy. That is really what it boils down to. Because again, every company is in business to do one thing, and that's to make money. And it has to make sure that it ties in to the business strategy of the organization. But when we talk about looking at these talent management decisions, being able to track external conditions that affect that talent availability, reflecting on the organizational values. What is it that we need? Who do we currently have? How do we commit to this positive workforce? How do we keep our employees engaged? Because really, believe it or not, about 60% or more of people are not engaged, okay, and it's only getting worse. And so as an organization, right, organizations have to figure out, how do we keep people engaged? That's part of talent management. And then being able to look at those talent pools, right? Employees who meet that formal set of identification. Again, looking at those high potential employees and the potential global assignees that we may need to bring on, helping employees target their career development efforts, what can be useful, looking at crisis management from a standpoint. How do we identify solid performers? As you notice, I didn't say high performers in this aspect, but how do you identify solid performers? Because I know solid employees that were not high performers, but they were committed, they were dependable, they were valuable, they showed up, but they, some people may say, oh, they're mediocre. Well, they will be considered solid at this point, right? Because they're showing up and they're committed. So how do you, as an organization, if you're working in the talent management part of your organization in HR, because again, talent management is an HR function, right? It's under our umbrella. How do you identify those solid performers? And then how do you help, make those compensation decisions and contribute to what we call knowledge management? Talk about succession planning. We know succession planning is also part of an HR function. You know, being able again to look at where the company's going, where they're, where we are, where we're going, how we're going to get there. The what ifs. Again, this kind of ties into the workforce planning aspect. Succession planning is done alongside senior leaders, along with the CFO, looking at what type of finances is available, right, and being able to identify those high potential employees for positions for future needs. Okay, because what we know to be true is, hey, we got 5 people that's set to retire. Now, are they going to retire? We don't know, right? But we have to prepare for it. Or, okay, we got 5 people that's going to retire, but one of them go on vacation and God forbid something happens to them and they end up and they can't work anymore. Preparing for future needs. Again, you always have to always side on the side of what if. Because nothing is ever certain when it comes to the work that we do as HR professionals. I've known people literally in my career, we didn't know the person was unhappy, went on vacation and never came back. Or they came back to Indianapolis, but they didn't come back to work. And this was not like middle level. This was like a VP type of person. Just overnight, things changed, right? We didn't know they were unhappy. We had no clue, right? So these things happen, okay? These things happen. They're paid a high salary. So clearly they were good, but at the end of the day, we would have been glad to know, at least have an opportunity to try to fix it, but they didn't want to come back. They went on vacation. They had they had epiphany, they said they decided to come back, and them and the wife talked about it and they're done. Again, succession planning. What do you do when something like that happens? You weren't able to prepare for it. The person went on vacation one week, came back and turned in their stuff the next week. What do you do, right? This stuff happens, right? So when you talk about succession planning, dealing with the what ifs, dealing with, we know people are going to be ready to retire. We know that we're about to have to terminate such and such, or we know XYZ. Again, filling in the X plus the Y is going to give you what? This is what you have to think of when you talk about succession planning, and making sure that when you look at succession planning, that it aligns with career management, training, learning, and performance. Again, we should not just be hiring people just to put somebody in a seat. That is the worst thing we can do as HR professionals. Yes, I know that we are all fighting for the same talent, but when organizations hire people just to hire people, we are doing our organization a disservice, because if that person does not work out, we've lost out on money, recruiting cost. Now it's affecting our turnover, our metrics, and everything, right? So it's important that we understand that who we hire, yes, we're hiring them for that position, but we also need to be thinking about future promotion, looking at performance management, focusing on what I call the long-term needs and the cultivation of that talent, right? Replacement planning, which focus on those immediate needs. Going back to my example, the VP that left and quit, we had to fill in, and we did have someone to fill in. But most companies don't have someone that can step into that high level and oversee a department of 25 people at such a high level. But manufacturing, for the most part, the ones I worked in were pretty good at this succession planning because of such a high turnover anyway in the manufacturing industry, right? But again, that replacement planning, you don't always have immediate needs. And so what happens if you run into that? It's much more easier to replace an entry-level person than it is to replace somebody in management, senior management, or VP or C-suite. When you talk about ingredients of effective succession planning, because there is a such thing as effective and ineffective, right? We want to make sure that we have effective succession planning according to SHRM. And they're saying, hey, listen, these are the components: visible support, leadership criteria, defined, planned, simple, measurable processes, alignments and alignment to organizational culture, leadership development plus, and organizational priority. So if you were studying this and you came across ingredients for succession planning, you would probably want to know some of these. These are the components that make succession planning successful. These are the components that make succession planning successful. And of course, we heard of the 9-box grid. Okay, this is kind of looking at performance. I've used one of these before in my previous organization. Again, manufacturing HR was so brutal, but I learned a lot. But again, looking at performance management, looking at who's underperforming, who's effective, and who's outstanding. And so it's basically broke down. Again, a 9 grid is broke down in three levels: high potential, medium potential, low potential. So if you were studying this, the best advice I could give you is say that that 9-box grid has 3 levels: low, medium, high potential. That is the best thing you could remember about 9-box grid. 9-box grid has high potential, medium potential, low potential, okay? And then under those components, you have under, effective, and outstanding. So again, it's just kind of looking at it's a performance management tool, okay? And of course, there's my little slide that's empty. So again, document that one so you could go back and study it. It's blank, blank. And we're almost at the end of this. And so looking at knowledge management, just know that knowledge management is basically an organization that's taking information, policies, and trying to prevent that loss from going out the door. Okay. So again, we don't want to lose any institutional knowledge, whether the person's been there for 3 months, 3 years, or 30 years. Knowledge management says, how are we going to capture that? Are we going to capture it in a policy? Are we going to capture it in an SOP? We want to get all that information that's inside their head, someone that's been doing the job for 20, 15, 20, 30 years, and whether we lose them through layoffs, involuntary, voluntary reassignments, or reduction in force, or basically what have you, we want to make sure that we prevent all that information from going out the door. So we want to capture that institutional knowledge so that we can continue to build our internal employees. Again, because again, the job is to get employees to maximize their potential. That is what we're responsible for doing. So it doesn't matter if you're benefits HR or your talent management or OE HR, it does not matter. All of us under the HR umbrella is to make sure that we manage our human capital and that we maximize their potential. That helps the organization increase and be what we call long-term sustainable and profitable at the same time. So it doesn't matter what part of HR you are. We have to look at human capital differently. I know that in HR, we sometimes have this thing where we work in a silo where the person's like, well, I'm benefits and I'm this. But truthfully, if we look at it from holistically from a standpoint, we are all supposed to contribute to that human capital so that we can get them to maximize their potential so that it helps the organization reach their profit. Because again, every organization is in business to make money. So how do we establish this formal knowledge management system? Well, we have to look at our knowledge assets, create a place for it, a repository or a directory, encourage system use, and then update it. So again, you know, when you have people that's going to be retiring or leaving, or you're getting rid of a department, you know, not just wiping that department out or, you know, letting those people retire, you need to capture what they've learned, capture it in a document, and then find a way to protect that asset, whether it's a directory or repository, and then encourage people to use what you've captured, and then make sure that you continue to monitor that system and update it. Some of the success factors of a knowledge management system is being able to look at the environment and the structure. You know, where is knowledge underutilized? Okay, so if there's a certain department that's not doing so well, and you know that the person in that department is only, maybe it's a department of 10 people, right? And out of 10 people, those five of them knows really what's happening in that department, and 3 of them are about to retire. So what are you going to do about the existing knowledge before it's lost and underutilized? You need to capture it. You need to capture it, help develop the skills of the people that is not getting the job done to that level of output. And then you have to look at it, you know, what's in it for me? Develop a project criteria and identify some of the challenges that go along with that underutilized or that lost knowledge that's going to go out the door. Because again, if you have a department of 10 and only 3 people really know what's happening and know how to hit the ground 10 toes down, and 2 of them, 3 are about to retire, we got to figure out, what are we going to do about the knowledge of the 2 people that's about to retire? The 1 person that's left, they only know what they're doing. The other 6 don't. And so what do? We can't leave this 1 person that knows everything to try to help these other 5 or 6 people. We have to figure out a structure and move through those multicultural challenges by looking at our knowledge management system and the success factors. Well, we have to do social sharing, you know, making sure that we understand the social sharing is employers must transform ad hoc social learning, be able to transfer it into something that's structured and rigorous. We have to be able to look at technology, look at our knowledge management opportunities, find a way to build solutions, and then leverage that collective experience of the people within and both outside the organization. Again, my same example, we need to utilize those 2 people that's about to retire before they leave the organization. And then maybe look at, you know, taking those other 5 or 6 people and putting them through some training or giving them professional development in order to make sure we share knowledge and information, and making sure that we are able to benchmark and look at this from a thought leadership standpoint. Okay, so we're at the end of this. We got 3 questions, and then I'll get you out of here. So let me move this up here. Any questions about workforce planning, staffing planning, or anything else?
None here.
It's rainy, and I think we all just kind of like, it's time to go to bed. Eat and go to bed. I get it. I'll get you out of here, promise, in 10 minutes. We'll get through these questions. So the first one, let me pull up my answers here. So the first question is, which step of the workforce analysis process determines which necessary competencies do not exist in the workplace? workforce. Which step, I told you all they kind of hit you with that first step, which step of the workforce analysis? Remember 6 steps, remember? We went from talking about workforce planning, and workforce planning consists of workforce analysis, and workforce analysis has 6 steps. Which step of the workforce analysis process determines which necessary competencies do not exist in the workforce? Which one can we get rid of? We know what is supply analysis?
What we currently have.
Okay. What's gap analysis?
What we're
We
lacking.
don't have.
Who we're lacking.
Mhm.
Okay. Demand analysis is what?
What do we need?
What we need. And solution analysis is what? How we bring all it together to impact the workforce, the solution of it. So the question is, which step of the workforce analysis process determines which necessary competencies do not exist in the workforce?
Would it be D?
Gap. Because it says remember, gap is what we're missing. When we have a workforce and we're missing certain competencies and skills, that means we have a gap analysis, right? And it says which necessary competencies shows that it does not exist. The gap will tell us what we're missing. So it's gap analysis.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So again, it goes back to kind of knowing those steps. That's kind of how they get you. Okay, the next one is, how does replacement planning differ from succession planning? Before I even look at the answers, let's learn from each other. What's the difference between replacement planning and succession planning?
Replacement is immediate.
And succession planning is long-term. Perfect. Yes, I'm doing a good job today. Okay, I may get an A today. Awesome. So we know that to be true. Now let's look at our answers. How does replacement planning differ from succession planning? Replacement planning focuses primarily on lower level positions. Succession planning focuses on most critical positions and senior level leaders only. I don't think so. B, replacement planning ensures the continuity of business operation. Succession planning provides deep bench strength through the organization.
Possibly.
Possibly. Replacement planning is based on an ever-evolving organization. Succession planning is focused on short-term organizational needs.
No.
No.
And then D, replacement planning is a systematic approach carried out across all lines of business. Succession planning is more important to organizational continuity. Which two can I know that we can eliminate?
Can eliminate A and C.
A and C. Yep.
A and C is correct. So now we're left with B and D.
I'm leaning towards B.
Yeah. Deep bench strength. Yeah.
Mhm.
B is correct. Good job. See, like I said, you'll get some questions like this that's easy, but then you have to sit back and say, okay, what's replacement and what's succession? See, once you know kind of part of the question, it's easy to try to decipher which ones you can eliminate. So yes, in this question, it's B. Replacement planning ensures continuity of business operations, because remember, replacement is immediate. And remember, we don't want to mess up the operation of our business. So we need to go out and find anybody, whether it's a freelancer, a consultant, or somebody from Robert Half. We need to get somebody in here immediately, right? So that it does not disrupt business operation. And then we know, succession planning provides a deep bench strength throughout the organization. Okay, good job, you all. Last one. When is knowledge management most productive? Knowledge management. Before we answer that, what is knowledge management?
Maintaining or keeping the knowledge that we had or things that we've learned.
Yeah, keeping the things we learned, where we're going to store it at. Do we have a depository or a directory? Do we have a library of SOPs? Like, where do we store all of this knowledge? Great. So when is knowledge management most productive? Okay, first answer, when it develops new procedures and create organizational policies. Maybe. No, maybe. When it focuses on acquiring knowledge from outside sources and solving problems. C, when the organization implements change and commits to employees' development. Or when it focuses on sharing organizational learning and reducing knowledge loss. I know y'all know this one.
Yeah, D.
You see how easy some of them may be?
Yeah.
It's like, you know, instantly, some of them you're just like, no, and you are correct. D is the answer for knowledge management. When is it most productive? When you can focus on sharing it organizationally, learning and reducing loss. Good job. Okay, well, that's it. That's it. Let me stop sharing my screen here and check in with you. What questions do you have, or what can I answer for you before I give you back some of your time? How are you all feeling? Feeling okay?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that was good. It was very helpful.
Okay, good. I'm glad I didn't get to meet you last week, so I'm glad I got to meet you. I was here last week. I filled in, so it's good to meet you. I'm glad. I know we were missing a few people, but it's definitely been an honor. So I just want to say thank you all for letting me be before you. I truly enjoyed this, and like I said, spending time with you all. You know, you all are doing great. Just stay the course. You know, don't give up. I know it's easier said than done, but just come to the resolve that you are going to follow through with this. You know, and just keep studying and make your way through it and schedule your exam and reach out to resources. Please consider me a resource. You know, hit me up on LinkedIn. We can connect on LinkedIn. I think I have my contact information, but consider me a resource, whether now or later. So don't feel like you're by yourself, whether, you know, you're certified or not. You're an HR professional. So for me, you're under the same umbrella as me. So just know that I'm here for you as a resource, whether now or later. So anything I can answer for you before we go?
I don't think so. Not for me.
Okay. Any questions or feedback for me that can help me if I facilitate again this semester, or should I say in the next couple of weeks? Any feedback you all can give for me to be a better facilitator? I love
No, I definitely appreciate to standard and not time. So greatly appreciated.
Love it. Love it. Love it. Love it. I'll take that. Awesome. Awesome. Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Listen, enjoy the rest of your evening. Be safe. And I truly do mean that. Patrick's been knowing me for years. If you need me, whether you want to reach out personally or professionally, please feel free to do that. Consider me a resource, and I wish you nothing but blessings and success. And so, yeah, enjoy your evening.
Thank
Thank
you
you
very
so
much.
much.
Thank you. See ya.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye. You ready, buddy? Want to go outside?